It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Prime Minister marrying Carrie Symonds in a secretly planned wedding at Westminster Cathedral, Israel's opposition parties agreeing to form a government, and Donald Trump's blog being scrubbed from his website, having gone live with great fanfare less than a month earlier. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Sorcha Bradley and Joe Evans, and from Money Week, the man who shines when the stock market slumps, it's Mr. John Stepek. And John, you are starting the episode this week, so strap in everybody. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Shareholder democracy can change the world.
I think what we're seeing with these votes is the desire to continue to put pressure in that space and in areas where we can to accelerate that to help society move through this transition. But at the same time, recognize we're going to continue to need oil and gas as societies transition.
CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Wood, speaking to CNBC earlier this week. John, what's been going on?
Well, so long story short, Exxon is one of the biggest oil companies in the world, and it has historically been one of the most intransigent when it comes to dealing with things like climate change. And over the years, various investors have got slightly annoyed about this. And what has happened, actually it happened last Wednesday, is that a tiny hedge fund called Engine Number One, which owned a tiny amount of Exxon shares, managed to get a couple of people that it had put forward onto the Exxon board. And the way this works is that minority shareholders can make proposals and then all the other shareholders vote on it. And in this case, they managed to convince all of the kind of biggest shareholders that they should back them. So in effect, Exxon now has a couple of board members who are climate activists, which is quite a big change for one of the world's biggest oil companies.
So they're climate activists, but they're not like a protest group, are they? They are backed by large US asset managers like Vanguard and BlackRock. So presumably they think there is a financial gain to this strategy, even though also, presumably, everyone else on the ExxonMobil board thought this is going to affect our bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an interesting topic because the way it's been discussed is, it's big oil's coming up against climate change and that sort of stuff. But this is much more than a protest vote. I mean, as I was saying, Exxon has always been one of the least responsive big oil companies. So recently you've had Shell, for example, kind of like talking about how it's going to reduce emissions, and BP doing the same and investing a bit in wind power. Now you can call all that greenwash, but Exxon to an extent has even resisted greenwash. And as much as it shows the power of protest, it also shows that the political environment has changed, and a lot of these big investors think, well, look, sorry, you're going to have to come to grips with this. It's no longer going to be, you can't just carry on with business as usual. So it's as much, there is a business case to it as much as a kind of, environmental case.
And Joe, this is bigger than just ExxonMobil, isn't it? I saw a piece in Bloomberg on this, headlined, "The Day the World Changed for Big Oil." Why?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of things that have happened this week which will all impact big oil companies quite dramatically. And they all actually happened on the same day, as John said, last Wednesday. One of these was that Chevron shareholders voted that the company should reduce Scope 3 emissions that arise from its products, which is quite a wide-ranging collection of emissions, actually. Scope 1 is direct emissions from owned and controlled sources. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity or steam, that kind of thing. And Scope 3 actually includes all indirect emissions that occur in the company's value chain. On the same day, a Dutch court ordered Shell to cut its emissions by 45% by the end of 2030 compared with 2019 levels. And while Shell's share price was unaffected by the ruling, which suggests that shareholders weren't hugely spooked by this, it is the first time that a judge has ordered a big company like Shell to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement by cutting its emissions in a court of law.
Sorcha, we've seen the energy companies do a fair bit of greenwashing over the past few years, as John was suggesting there, but remaining with the biggest part of their businesses in planet-polluting activity. It feels like this time they're really going to have to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, absolutely. As John was saying earlier, this isn't a group of eco-warriors coming into the boardroom and saying, we demand change. They're saying, look, there's a business case for this. There's a business case for us reducing our carbon emissions. And one of the campaign managers said, plan for a world where maybe the world doesn't need your oil barrels. So this group, Engine Number One, are looking towards a future where actually oil production on the mass scale that Exxon produces isn't necessary, isn't part of that future. And it's also a bit of an indictment on how the company's been managed so far. They're basically coming in and saying, if you continue on this track, you're not going to continue making money. So it's pretty big move.
Yeah, why are they lagging behind in the US, John, compared to Europe even, at adopting more climate conscious habits?
I mean, that's a good question, and I'd struggle to answer it kind of honestly, but I suspect it's just because they are historically slightly more, what's the word?
Gas guzzling?
Yeah, gas guzzling culture, and also more sceptical attitude towards climate change.
Yeah.
And that, that is no longer viewed as politically acceptable. I don't care what your personal opinion is, this is just the way it is. And I think a lot of that is about, look, Exxon, you have to wake up and recognise that this is the world that we now live in. I mean, it is tricky because, there's a whole issue of, well, if the Western oil companies are going to have to cut back in producing oil and it turns out that we still need oil, which we probably do, then the people who are going to produce it for us are the Saudis and the Russians.
Right.
And, that does, mean that all you're doing is funneling money from a set of people who you can control to an extent to a set of people who really don't care. And there are other issues such as if you end up putting oil companies under too much pressure, then what happens is that a private equity buyer might just at some point say, actually, we're going to take it off the market and then we're not answerable to shareholders at all. And then, you can all kind of go and sing about ESG elsewhere. We'll just pump as much oil as we want. So, there are side effects. There's always consequences to these sorts of things.
But also, it's in response to a market, isn't it, Joe? I mean, to be fair to all the big oil and gas companies, they are providing a service that until arguably last year, because of the pandemic and people not flying and driving so much, people actually needed. And, I've still got a gas boiler in my house. I need some gas. I cook with gas. So we all get the long-term goal, but it's reasonable, isn't it, to provide a service people need at the point they need it?
No, that's quite right. And I think that actually what you've just alluded to is a sort of realisation that's going on simultaneously in Exxon's boardroom and also among the public, that this need to embrace a transition to a low-carbon future, whatever that might look like, is mounting both publicly and as a side effect mounting in boardrooms. I think what John just said is very interesting in terms of how it's a complicated political and especially sort of foreign affairs related issue, because as John has just said, America has had a traditionally slightly more sceptical stance towards climate politics. I don't think that's the case anymore with Biden, who's told America's power sector that they've got to stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in 15 years. And that is going to create very complicated foreign affairs issues down the line if oil and gas production is still necessary in 15 years' time. We've seen that sort of happen already here in Europe, where there's been more pressure on governments to pressure their biggest companies to go greener. And we've seen it, for example, in Germany, which has got great green credentials in terms of its own output. But then when you look at the kind of relationships they have to make up for that, it results in uncomfortable relationships with countries like Russia. And so I think that those issues are also quite striking and could come along further down the line if the low carbon future is what we start to see in the next 20 to 25 years.
So, Sorcha, if you're an environmental campaigner, what do you take away from this story? People have been trying to put pressure on the big oil and gas companies for the last 30 years to do something, to be more renewable, not to just greenwash. And it seems like actually the thing that's made them possibly sit up and take notice is money, like it's investment. It's getting people behind you that are actually saying, let's make a profit out of this strategy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of environmental campaigners, what they'll say is, well, capitalism and the fundamental way in which capitalism works means that is completely incompatible with, saving the planet and with reducing carbon emissions. But actually, this is essentially a group of capitalists. They're a group of business people who've gone in and said there's a market case to change our strategy. And so that's what we should do. So I think it kind of turns that concept on its head that capitalism can't be involved in our future climate change strategies. Because after all, unless the world as we know it alters dramatically, which I think lots of climate change activists would argue maybe it does, then we're not going to depart from that system. And this shows that maybe capitalism and business can have a role in, impacting carbon emissions in a positive way.
And do you see more of this happening in the future, John? I mean, $50 million obviously is a lot of money, but ExxonMobil has a market value of close to $250 billion. So engine number one's stake is really, I'd go as far to say achievable, isn't it? If you had 1,000 people who were moderately wealthy who really supported a cause, you could get them all together and raise $50 million to get a seat on the board of any company you wanted, couldn't you?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating what it says about shareholder democracy and the nature of company ownership. It's a double-edged sword in some ways, because the reason that engine number one could do this is because the big pension funds, and probably more importantly, the big passive funds, all backed it. So that's how they get a majority. And one of the things, all of those funds, particularly the passive ones, own the shares on the behalf of end investors. So for example, I've got a tiny bit of Exxon in my pension. I suspect that anyone who's got a workplace pension who's on the phone right now probably owns it too, because it's just a massive American company and one of your pension funds probably owns it. The question then is, would you want to have seen this kind of climate change campaigner getting elected to the board? And you may say yes, you may say no, but you didn't actually vote for it one way or the other. So I think the next step is having the passive funds and the pension funds communicate these things better to their investor, to the holders, and then finding a way, because we've got digital, we've all got phones now. If you own shares, you probably own a smartphone. You could easily put these things to the vote across your end owners, and then the passive fund would then vote according to what the majority of people had said. I think that, and the more you can see people engage with that, the better. You're seeing it in America with all these mad little stocks that are going up, thousands of %, like the GameStop phenomenon. That's actually a very similar thing. So I think the more engagement we can get with the ultimate holder of these shares, the more people will feel that they're empowered to act, and be a much more effective form of democracy in a funny kind of way.
Must make being a FTSE 100 CEO a lot harder than it used to be, Joe.
Yes, I can only imagine it did. And I think that the way that Exxon's management responded to the results coming out is probably an indication of the fact that they would agree, because a recess was called when the shareholders basically just sat and watched blank screens and listened to music for an hour, which may suggest that they too were sort of running around trying to figure out how to deal with what had just happened. But I think that sort of speaks to what John's just said, that it's a far more effective form of protest, isn't it? It can only be said that the board of Exxon will be far more concerned about having two climate change activists in the room than they would be again about Extinction Rebellion protesters taking a sledgehammer to the windows at the front of their headquarters. And I think, if that's how to impact big companies and make them adapt to the carbon neutral future we need, then I think that's probably a good thing.
Okay, Joe, you're up next after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Tinker, Skrædder, Soldet, Spion.
The report says that the US had tapped into undersea internet cables by taking advantage of a surveillance collaboration with the Danish government. Calls, texts, internet searches and chats were all accessible, something the Danish government has been aware of since a 2015 report, but failed to tell its neighbours.
Fraser Jackson from France 24 reporting on Monday. Joe, what's the story?
So Denmark, it transpires, has been helping a US intelligence agency eavesdrop on the phone calls of various leading politicians across Europe, most prominently Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, also the Foreign Minister of Germany and the Leader of the Opposition across 2 years. It transpires that the Danish Military Intelligence Service allowed the NSA in America to tap their government communications through a listening post near Copenhagen airport.
You're saying all this with a very sort of cynical, weary, like, oh, it emerges, this and that. I mean, this was quite a shocking story, wasn't it? I mean, it has been underreported.
It certainly has, and I think that's probably partly to do with the fact that it broke on a sun-soaked Bank Holiday Monday in the UK, which may have perhaps distracted some people. But I think the reason that I'm slightly weary in my tone is because this is a continuation of something that we've known has been taking place for some time, right? Edward Snowden 8 years ago was a contractor for the NSA, and he revealed that the agency had been routinely snooping on the electrical communications of millions of people around the world, including lots of close Obama allies. I think what's striking about this one is that 8 years on from Snowden, we're still having these stories leak out. And it does just show the extent and the depth of this surveillance that the Obama administration, and it should be said probably various US administrations, have carried out on their allies over the years.
Can you just talk me through how it works? I mean, we heard in the clip something about undersea internet cables, but that, I mean, I know we're talking about 2012, but that feels a bit 1960s.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Hence the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy reference in my teaser.
Hence my own excellent allusion.
But essentially how it works is that the NSA, first of all, actually had been spying on Danish ministers and also European defence manufacturers through a very similar deal with Denmark's military intelligence agency, which incidentally is known as FE. Essentially, it's claimed that they gave the NSA access to telephone traffic, some of which went through the listening post that I earlier referred to, and some of which did go through the undersea cables that you referred to, which does, as you say, slightly put you in mind of sort of Colin Firth and Gary Oldman in a back room somewhere in London.
Sorcha, what's more worrying, do you think, to France and Germany? The fact that America might be spying on them, or that a European ally would be assisting?
I think it's difficult to say, really. Obviously, having a close geographical ally spying on you is a problem. Perhaps, France and Germany, particularly Germany, maybe they are concerned by these reports because they are diverging with Washington still on a number of issues to do with their approach to Russia and China. For example, Germany really wants to push ahead with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Washington is against that. There are a number of kind of ongoing issues between European states and America that could be in the forefront of Angela Merkel's mind when she hears of these reports that she's been spied on. But at the same time, this is a historic issue. This is something that happened a while ago, and obviously something that's, as Joe was just saying, been suspected of for a long time due to Edward Snowden's leaks. So whether or not it will have a long-term impact, I doubt it. But obviously at some point, kind of normal diplomatic relations clearly weren't trusted in the way that you would expect them to be between such close allies.
I mean, it may have been suspected for a long time, John, but there's an argument that just wasn't properly looked into. I mean, since this report has been released, Snowden himself has posted a cryptic tweet in Danish saying, "If only there had been some reason to investigate many years ago, why didn't anyone warn us?"
Yeah. I mean, he's a bit of a smart aleck, but I think the issue here is the embarrassment for a lot of the countries involved, because ultimately I am not that surprised that America's spying on everyone. I suspect that all spies are spying on everyone, including their friends, all the time. So there's a little bit of me that is kind of like, well, so what? It's not ideal. At the same time, Germany is sort of somewhat dependent on Russia for gas, as Sorcha mentioned. So I can see why America might want to know the content of some of those conversations. And yeah, it is embarrassing, but there's a part of me that thinks, what's Denmark going to say to America? Oh, no, they're our pals, go away. You know what I mean? So I think, to be honest, the biggest fallout is more that this is just really embarrassing. Nobody wants to know that, all right, Denmark was grassing us up to the Americans. How are you going to deal with this? So I can see it just all getting swept under the carpet again.
I mean, maybe some hypocrisy as well, Joe, in the outrage of other European nations to this, because, as John suggests, I mean, I think if you're Angela Merkel, you probably assume that Russia and China are listening to your calls. I mean, in a way, it's not as worrying that your friends are listening too, is it? I mean, if you're relatively relaxed about your enemies tuning in, I mean, of course the Americans are going to be listening as well.
No, quite right. And possibly even more, actually, hypocrisy, because it was actually reported in 2015 that German intelligence had spied on both the French government and the European Commission, passing on the products to the NSA. It was also reported that in Der Spiegel not long before that German intelligence had, and I quote, accidentally eavesdropped on Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. So no, perhaps not hugely surprising that they're all spying at each other. However, I do think this is very, very awkwardly timed for the US. Biden is coming to the UK next week as part of G7, which will be the first trip he's done to Europe. It's not ideal timing in terms of him meeting his European allies after running on a campaign of rebuilding that transatlantic relationship post-Trump.
And of course, crucially, he was vice president at the time of these allegations, wasn't he?
Of course, yes. He was Obama's VP, and Edward Snowden also made the point that Biden would almost certainly have known about this at the time. It also comes at a time that Washington and Brussels are in the midst of negotiating a new transatlantic data transfer deal, which was the original deal was knocked down because of the EU's concerns over US spying, so it's not ideal timing for that. And the EU is also revamping its rules to better protect its infrastructure, its government IT and public services from cyber attacks and intrusion. So again, not ideal timing for Biden on that front either.
In terms of all these stories being leaked, Sorcha, I mean, does this mean that the secret services aren't working as secretly as they once were?
I mean, perhaps. Obviously, in the wake of the Snowden reports in 2013, Obama said he was going to stop spying on his allies. So, I mean, and that clearly hasn't happened. So, you know, maybe they're not as covert as they think they are. But obviously, kind of the bigger picture is that although we kind of might say, oh, well, of course, everyone's spying on everyone, I think it is a matter of trust. And if a world leader says, you know, we're going to commit to stop spying on our allies, and then it doesn't, then breakdown of trust between allies is always a bad thing for global security and peace, really. So I think, you know, we have to be careful of not being too cynical about it and just assume that kind of this is the way the world is. I think there are some clear issues in terms of the way that diplomacy is working if these conversations can't be had out in the open.
Yeah, and I think that point about cynicism is very important as well, because it does also speak to the way that intelligence relationships diverge and converge at different times. You know, it's slightly awkward now to look back on the fact that the British had a very close relationship with the Libyan intelligence services, for example, prior to the invasion of Iraq. And, you know, whatever you think about the merits or otherwise of the invasion of Iraq and rendition to Libya, rather, it does just evidence the fact that actually no secret service has got a clean rap record when it comes to this stuff. It does, you know, probably also speaks to the fact that we know more and more about what these intelligence services do. You know, we didn't know about the existence, you know, the British state didn't acknowledge the existence of our intelligence service, GCHQ, and the Secret Intelligence Service until 1994. And it's probably just the case that actually when they were operating fully in the shadows, they could just get away with this stuff, and it wasn't as diplomatically embarrassing as it now is, as John mentioned earlier.
It makes you wonder, John, whether the sort of real deals happen in places that aren't the ones that are reported even in these leaks. Because if you know you're being recorded, then you're not going to do the deal at all, are you? You're going to, I'm thinking kind of House of Cards style here, going to send some guy to some ante-room with some stepladders in it. And that's where the real conversation's going to happen.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you do wonder. I mean, I do veer in my own head between thinking this is basically all nonsense, and the other side of me thinking actually there's this whole world that I know nothing about where everything that matters is happening. And it also, I mean that's what a spy would say. Exactly.
Sorry, finish your point.
No, it's that thing of because the other issue that made me think is, well, you know, if you're spying on defence policies, there's a lot of valuable business information there too, potentially. You know, like Airbus and Boeing are massive rivals, transatlantic rivals. I mean, who's to say that there isn't some sort of, you know, jockeying for industrial espionage going on as well? So yeah, I think, I guess the thing that gets me is I don't know what you do about it. You know, how do you? It's sort of almost an extension of this fact that we kind of take it for granted that all of our communications as individuals are being monitored all the time, and that Google knows everything that we do. And it kind of feels like almost an extension of that. It's just that we're now aware that it happens.
Sorcha, I'm going to be monitoring your communications after this. Sorcha, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we end the quest for eternal life?
In Britain, they say, long live the Queen. In India, while blessing you, elders often say, may you live a long life. But how long can we really live? How long can a human life possibly be? The oldest person currently alive is 118 years old. Her name is Kane Tanaka. She lives in Japan's Fukuoka. A woman named Jean-Louise Clement has lived the longest till date. She was 122 years and 164 days old.
Palki Sharma reporting for WION India about human longevity. Sorcha, what's the story?
So this is a new study published in Nature Communications that suggests the absolute limit of the human lifespan is around 150 years old. So scientists analysed medical data from hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and they essentially boiled them down to, all this data down to a measurement of ageing called the Dynamic Organism State Indicator. And the findings suggest that the human body's ability to bounce back and to recover from stress factors limit the lifespan to about 150 years only. So if anyone's got any dreams of one day that we might all, achieve immortality, then this study suggests that that is essentially impossible, for now anyway.
Well, I mean, this is the challenge, isn't it? This is the gauntlet that's been thrown down in Silicon Valley, where, there are startups out there working on longevity and saying, this is a problem we can overcome. There's a lot we can do with surgery. There's a lot we can do with changing people up, making them bionic. Why can't we live to 300?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest hopes in a way of potentially prolonging our lifespan and also our health span, that's very important, is the drug metformin, which is actually a really cheap type 2 diabetes drug. And that is currently undergoing a clinical trial to see if it can treat aging, essentially. And one of the main benefits of that is that it's really cheap and something that can be mass produced, and we already know it exists. So the outcome of those trials could potentially, be a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, to show if we can potentially increase our lifespan far beyond what it currently is.
John, do you fancy living to 150?
Yeah, definitely. The question with all these things is how are you whenever you get there? I think that's the big issue, is increasing your health span. And I think that the interesting thing here is that you're right, Silicon Valley has already acknowledged that aging is something that should be treated like a disease, because it does impose this limit. And the idea is that if you can find a way to actually stop aging or reverse it, or at least slow it down, then you could extend the life limit to beyond 150. But, at the end of the day, 80 is the current life expectancy. So 150, that's nearly double that. I'll take that any day.
You know what the story will be, Joe? It'll be now 90-year-olds can't get their feet on the housing ladder.
I know. It was funny, John, saying the average life expectancy. I think it's 84. I've just had a meeting with a financial advisor, and he told me when I was going to die, which was very grim, to be honest with you. I can think of nothing worse than living to 150. I've got to be honest with you. I'm total opposite end of the spectrum to John. I'm just not convinced that any human being is equipped for that much change in a lifetime, be that political change or social change or technological change. There's also, and I was thinking about this just because John was on the podcast, the issue of just outliving all of your assets. I mean, imagine how you'll have to be a very astute investor to be able to retire at anything like a reasonable age and still be able to support yourself if you're going to live to 150.
Yeah, and we've come a long way already, haven't we? I read recently that in 1842, the average tradesman in Britain died in their mid-20s. And in Bethnal Green in the East End of London, the working poor lived on average to the age of 16. So, to have managed to get to a stage now where we're all expecting, if we don't get hit by a car or get terminal cancer, to live to our 70s, 80s or 90s, isn't that, enough? The focus should be on how well are you during that period and making sure people in their 50s and 60s are better than worrying about the ones who can live to 150, surely.
I think you can focus on both of those things, though. It's one of those sort of false dichotomy questions, isn't it? We shouldn't go to Mars when the NHS needs more funds. Do you know? It's like neither of those things is dependent on the other. No, so and I think that's a really interesting point you made, Joe, about the amount of change in one lifetime. Because you're right, I sort of think back to what my kind of grandparents did, and they saw things like the telly and the aeroplane, coming about, never mind the internet. But at the same time, I think if this is the only life we've got, then you might as well stay on it for as long as you can, because you're an awful long time dead. So I think, yeah, I get that a lot of people see this as a kind of secular religion, and to an extent it is. But I find it interesting the way that people sort of revel in the idea that there might be an absolute limit, because it's like, well, if this is all you've got, then why are you happy that it's going to be over at some point?
Just imagine the embarrassing out-of-touch things grandparents will say when they're 140.
That's a fair point.
Sorcha, why is this your story of the week? I mean, it's news. It is a real piece of scientific research, but it's sort of not news that we will all one day die. They've just managed to put an age on it. So why is this significant, do you think?
I think for me, it kind of highlights something that I personally think is important, in which that it's not necessarily about life expectancy, but it is about your healthy life expectancy. And that is something that is, not particularly good in the UK. For a man, your life expectancy is around 79 years. But your healthy life expectancy is only 63.2 years. So you'd spend 16 years, potentially not in good health. And that is a serious, I think, social ill that we're coming up against now and will increasingly do in the future. And what's good about these studies and potentially trials that kind of combat aging is that it also brings with it ways to increase our healthy life expectancy, because obviously no one wants to live forever if you're essentially falling to bits and decrepit. So it is something that we're moving towards a world where we don't just expect to live for a very long time, but we want to live well. And I think that's a commendable thing, and that's something, a bit of hope that we should all be striving towards and can do.
What I always enjoy about these stories as well, Joe, is that it leads the newscasters, doesn't it, to dig through that wonderful archive of people who have made it to kind of 110 odd. And when they ask them, what is it? What's the secret to eternal life? The answer's always something really off message, like, well, I eat 10 eggs. Or it's a fag and a glass of red wine.
I think, the oldest woman to have lived this far, I think, was 122, and I think she was a French woman who advised a glass of red wine every day.
Yeah.
Which, if it works, then it works, and it's a far better message than quinoa and asparagus, isn't it? It's more like to get people on board.
The life expectancy on this episode has elapsed, but we will be back next week. My thanks to Sorcha, Joe and John for their stories. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for time and memoriam. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.